Good morning. Thank you for coming, for attending. Unfortunately, this is not an in-person conversation as we very much would have wished. In fact, first of all, it really pains me not to have here the co-curators of the Strand Parallel Cinema that you've been seeing these days. They are here with us, Shivendra Singh Dungarpur and Omar Hamed. Shivendra is the founder of the Film Heritage Foundation, now affiliate member of FIAF. In the last few years, in my direct experience, has really changed the landscape of film preservation and restoration in India, training, organizing 5 workshops and more workshops online and throughout India with incredible efforts and commitment to really change the landscape of the awareness of the need for film preservation and restoration. Shivendra is also a filmmaker, and he's just our dream maker when it comes to accessing and restoring film heritage in India. Omar Hamed is possibly the scholar that has contributed the most in recent years to theorizing and problematizing and shaping a theory and historiography of Indian parallel cinema. So I am really just a link in between the two, and that's why this strand was possible, working together with them, trying to locate the best elements, the best prints, and working both in India and in Europe and in the US to trace the prints, and together with them trying to shape a strand that could, in just 8 screenings, which is the tip of the iceberg of the foundational years of parallel cinema, try to offer you an occasion to see possibly the best elements available right now, and also to invite you to dig more in what's a very obscure, rather obscure art movement or period of time in Indian history. But today we're extremely honored and humbled to have with us 2 of the pioneers of parallel cinema. The very term is problematic, so the acceptance of this term is already in question during this conversation. But let's say that we have here 2 masters, 2 pioneers, Girish Kasaravalli and Kumar Shahani. Thank you so much for being here. They've contributed enormously to the shaping of a new language and new aesthetics. We're screening here The Ritual, 1977, Mr. Kasaravalli first film, widely awarded. We wanted to screen Maya Darpan, we weren't able to, but we're screening today the Kayal Saga. I don't want to take more time because you're really here to listen to them. I must add, and Shivendra I think will rely on that today is also unfortunately a very sad day for Indian preservation, because Kivan Divar, who's been an archivist at the National Film Archive in Pune, unfortunately passed away, and it breaks our heart to give this information, and he was possibly the one knowing the whole collection at the National Film Archive of India. Shivendra, sorry to open with such a sad note, but it's impossible not to mention this since this is happening a few hours after you gave me this sad news.
Thank you, Cecilia. I think he was someone whom I sort of trusted in getting all the material from NFAI, and for NFAI, it's a huge loss, and after P.K. Nair, to have somebody like Divar. And I think what is really interesting is that all 3 of us, whether it's Mr. Kasaravalli or Mr. Shahani or myself, all 3 of us have had personal experiences with Divar, especially because we all came from the Film Institute Pune. We studied there, and we are all 3 different generations, and it's really an honor for me to have I would call them my teachers, because I learned filmmaking from watching their films. First of all, let me start this conversation, and I would request Omar to after I do a bit of introduction and a bit of what I want to ask, but I would ask Umar to ask all the questions because he's really the specialist on the new wave. And Umar, this was a project which you brought in. We all chipped into it, and I've had personal relationship with both of them. But what is interesting is that you're going to be dealing with two very different periods and time, and a very exciting time in the 70s when both Mr. Shahani and Girish started making films. Of course, Mr. Shahani much earlier. Two very different styles. You had Uski Roti yesterday, which was another great filmmaker from the new wave, Mr. Manikal. Mr. Shahani, of course, unfortunately, Maya Darpan would have been the film for me to see, but that's the film we really want to restore. And we hope that very soon we'll be able to restore Maya Darpan for people to see it. But I'm just going to ask one question to begin with to Mr. Shahani, and then Umar, I'll leave the floor to you. Sir, you started making films way back in the 70s, and 70s was incredibly politically charged period in India. There were experiments in the visual arts, there were experiments in the theater. So how did the Indian new wave sort of come about? Because you were moving away from the traditions of narrative cinema, and you went into something which is called formalism. You are the exponent of formalism. So would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, thank you for recalling those times where we were beginning to understand cinema only just then, really. I think until the late 60s, Indian cinema was rather stuck with a kind of a chronological forms, like a narrative which was linear, very straightforward storytelling, and sort of addressing the audiences with a very, very sort of, great amount of aggression, I would say, Ours was a movement to discover the language of cinema simultaneously, I think later on, when Girish, for instance, became a student at the Film Institute, I used to talk a lot about that how the cinema is actually discovering itself, discovering its own language. I had great teachers of the cinema. One was Ritik Ghatak, who was the most radical filmmaker, and the other one was Robert Bresson in France. And both of them had begun, so to say, the search for a language which would not just imitate reality, right? It would go far beyond that imitation and bring about relationships which are between colors, between forms, between what we did not know at that time and we know now is that there are n dimensions that exist, And when you speak of form, it is not just ending with the line, finding a form, but the form itself changing all the time, that this movement, All forms keep on changing, and that's how they get these wonderful dimensions. And as the dimensions reveal themselves, reality reveals itself, It's not as if reality is a given which you imitate, And that's what one was trying already with Maya Darpan, for example, which we were unfortunately not able to show because the nature of archiving in India has not supported these films which were made some time ago, and they need to be restored, And I'm sure, Shivendra, I'm one of your colleagues now, part of your FHA as well, that we together will be able to restore these films on photochemical celluloid, with that photochemical emulsions. This would be very, very important for cinema, the language of cinema, to continue to evolve. Because, photochemical work on celluloid is trying to get the natural bonding of molecules, which is not possible through the digital framework. This is very important. I want to stress this. I think I've gone on. I can't hear you.
Your microphone, Shivendra, went off.
No, I think it's beautiful. Umar, do you want to continue from here, asking Girish? I think.
Yeah. Thank you for including me in this dialogue and conversation today. I'm kind of a bit starstruck at the moment, being in the presence of filmmakers I've admired and like Kumar and Girish for such a long time, and all the work that Shivindra's done in terms of film preservation as well. It's so important and happening at a really kind of significant moment, I'd say, in terms of trying to kind of reclaim India's kind of cinematic past. But my opening question to both Kumar and Girish, if you'd like to start with your kind of response to this question, is both of you had formal training. So both of you went to film school. You both went to the FTII, which is the Film and Television Institute in India. So you were the first really kind of generation of filmmakers to have that kind of formal film education and training, which we hadn't seen before, because up until the early 1960s, there wasn't really anything like the institute in Pune, and which was really important in terms of helping the birth of kind of parallel cinema, which is a term which is often kind of disputed by a lot of people. What do we call this moment in India's history, the late 60s, early 70s? Parallel cinema seems to be often the one that everyone kind of wants to kind of circulate around. But going back to my question then, so what was it about the time and the kind of the training and the influences that you absorbed at the time during your kind of time at the Film Institute?
Is that a question for me or to?
Yeah, Girish, yes, if you'd like to start, please.
Yeah, one of the major, it's not a problem, it's observations that in India, each region has its own compulsions to evolve its own kind of cinematic idiom, which differs from region to region. I come from a southern Indian state, and we had different kind of compulsions and pressures when I started making my first film. In fact, I was in the Film and Television Institute of India, Pune, from 72 to 75. I passed out in 75 and started immediately. I got a producer and I started working on it. And that was the time when cultural and social situation in Karnataka was quite active, but it was quite different. The pressures were quite different from the rest of India. And the new literary movement, new movement in painting, new movement in theater has started. And I would like to see the Kannada new cinema as a continuation of the whole process. So many of the people who are practicing theater, literature and things, they were all Lohiites. Ram Manohar Lohia is an important political figure in India. And they tried to bring in all that kind of a political insights into their work. And whether one is a Lohiite or not, one is drawn into it by the whole social pressures and kind of artistic this one. And my first film and the successive films are all drawn from Kannada literature. So in a sense, I constantly keep interacting with the socio-political situations and the cultural expressions of the region here. So Gatashraddha, be it my first film Gatashraddha or my all the 14, 15 films that I have done, I was reacting to the situations that existed in my own home state.
Which is Kannada, right? Is it the Kannada region?
Yeah.
Is the Kannada region, if I'm not mistaken?
Kannada?
The region you're from.
I am from South India,
from
which is Karnataka.
Africa. Yeah.
It wasn't
I
it.
speak a language.
Wasn't Satyajit Ray saying that the future of cinema lies in Kannada cinema? Didn't he say that at some point?
Pardon?
Satyajit Ray said that the future of cinema lays in Kannada cinema. You've been depicted as fulfilling that prediction for a long time.
Yeah. What happened, between 67 and 77 or 80, the film movement in Karnataka was very strong. We were winning all the national awards. So that is one of the reasons why, what prompted Satyajit Ray to make that statement. But later on, of course, our Kannada film industry didn't live up to that expectation. Yeah.
The literary movement in Karnataka at the time was very strong, and there was a strong emphasis on protest, and particularly the criticisms and the critiques of caste as well, which kind of directly fed into your own kind of work, and which you've just briefly talked about. I mean, there was, if you go back to the early 60s and 70s as well, not just in Karnataka, but in other regions as well, there was more filmmakers turning to indigenous kind of Indian literature for the first time and using them as a source to kind of make films. Were you, Girish, did you see other filmmakers? Were you kind of inspired or influenced by other filmmakers who were doing that around you and thought, yeah, I need to do something similar to that?
Well, in Kannada, the movement started with a film called Samskara, which is again based on a novel by Dr. U.R. Anantmurthy, a very strong cultural figure. And my first film, Gatashraddha, is also based on his short story. Samskara was based on his novel, and my film was based on his short story. And then on, for quite some time, a lot of major literary works were turned into cinema, films. And one of the strengths of Kannada cinema of that time was they were directly connected with the kind of socio-political and cultural movement of Kannada and also of India at that time.
Yes, okay. Yes, this was a defining characteristic and feature of Indian parallel cinema throughout the 70s and even up until the 80s as well, the kind of the connection between literature and filmmaking, but also this strong kind of social political kind of impulse that came through, which had been there slightly. We'd seen it with the IPTA, Indian, the theatre kind of movement in the late 40s. It was kind of like a return to that. But can I go to Kumar as well? I mean, your experiences training at the FTII, what were the kind of, who were the kind of filmmakers? I mean, you trained under, is it Bresson in France as well? Can you tell us a bit more about your kind of experiences?
I first mentioned Ritika from Bangalore, of course, and I had met him before I saw him at the Film Institute. I had started a film, I was one of the persons who had started a film society in Bombay called Anandam. And Ritika had come from Bangalore, quite rejected by Calcutta, and to form his film, or something of that sort, He wanted to find an audience. So, Girish comes about 10 years later. actually, we should not be clubbed together in any way, you know. And the position he took, for instance, just now, is the position which is that every region of India has, of course, its own social, linguistic framework, which wants naturally to change, you know, and not get stuck with, you know, which is true. But I would like to say that when it came to Ritikda, he had not agreed with that.
Right.
It's true of any region in the world. It's not only true of India. Any region, of course, has its specificity. But Ritik came to the Film Institute later. But before that, I had seen him. I was one of the 3 persons outside of Bengal who saw Suvarnareka, you know, the film that you might know as being perhaps one of the most important films made not only in India, but in all of Asia and perhaps the world.
This was the third part of his trilogy, wasn't it?
Suvarnareka.
Yeah. Was it the third?
The partition trilogy, if you want to call it.
Yes.
Hiragatara, Komatanda, and Suvarnareka.
Right.
And you see, Ritik was automatically internationalist because of the partition. So am I. I was born in Pakistan.
Oh, okay.
So automatically, I'm an internationalist. And I'm most appreciated also, I think, across the subcontinent. You know, the last trip I made abroad was to Bangladesh. And, you know, I presided over that film festival. It's the first time I've done that. And, you know, for me, whether it's Pakistan or India, and within India, whether it's Kashmir or Karnataka or Kerala, you know, I look upon them as my own, right? And I've had the good fortune of also being invited at times to even develop institutions in different states of India, for example, or the Indian subcontinent, whichever way you want to look at. I wanted and have always wanted to get over the borders of nations and all that kind of thing, you know. And so do my daughters.
Yeah.
One of my daughters is an artist. The other daughter, and she's actually going so far as to even drop the line, you know, which creates the border, you know. Similarly, my eldest daughter worked for refugees in Britain, where you live, you know, and she still does. So she's constantly interested in the diaspora, for example, you know, whichever diaspora addresses itself. And I believe, along with St. Augustine, you know, who was always always a diasporic individual, that wherever you are on this earth, you are a stranger, you know. St. Augustine is the basis, his philosophy is the basis of life on earth. And it is from that Bressot took off.
Okay.
You know? So all this together makes me always search for a change in language. For me, Dante, for example, you're in Italy. I mean, you're not there. But there's an Italian audience, perhaps, in Bologna.
It's an international audience here, yes, but...
Right, but that location, Bologna.
Yes.
For me, Dante is is one of the greatest writers. He's mine as much as he's yours. And that's how I feel all the time. And therefore, I'm interested in the forms of language, of any language, every language, developing. And I consider cinema to be a language.
Yeah.
I don't care what other languages are juxtaposed to it, or what other nationalities come into play, nor do my children, you know. I know, and I'm very proud of that fact, and I'm sure more and more people will begin to feel that way. You know.
I think there's a number of interesting things you've just pointed out there. The first thing is the whole kind of internationalism of parallel cinema in the late 60s, early 70s. That was it resonated through a lot of the works and a lot of the kind of the filmmakers. But what was interesting is how over the years, I think you as filmmakers probably already realized this, but I think here in the West, we often thought that Ray had probably the most significant influence on the next generation of filmmakers. But I think there's been a massive shift now. And I think people have started to realize how significant Guttuk's work has been on that generation and coming through, particularly, I mean, he was this, for me, and hearing from you, he was the single most biggest influence on shaping the perceptions and the kind of the aesthetic break that we saw in parallel cinema in the late 60s, early 70s. And that's really important, his work now.
Yeah, because even Kumar, when I was in the institute, Ray was never an inspiration for us.
Right.
I mean, I discovered him much after the institute. In fact, I mean, Girish can talk about that, because I would like to know from Girish's time. For us, it was, we were deeply influenced by mostly Western filmmakers and Japanese and Kurosawa and Fellini and Tarkovsky and all that. But I think it was Ghattuk who was but having said that, there was divided sections. And I think I would like Girish to answer that question, because Girish, how did you view Satyajit?
To generalize, I think will be very difficult, because there are quite a big number of students who are greatly influenced by Ray, one among them. And also the Japanese cinema, Asian cinema in particular, because we believed in another kind of filmmaking, wherein, you know, go deeper into your society, and then, you know, it automatically gets universalized. A film which are very particular also gets generalized. So while making one has to be very particular, but while perception, you know, when the film is ready, it becomes universal. That's how we believed, and that's how I looked at it. Japanese masters. Okay, it's not correct to say the students at FTI were not impressed or enamored by the oeuvre of Satyajit Ray. Quite a big section of students in FTI and large section of Indian cineasts are still, you know, admire the oeuvre of Satyajit Ray.
Sorry. I have a question.
Yeah.
I think Cecilia has a question.
Sorry, just it's listening to you, it's very interesting, as it seems that this particular period in time, I'm hearing a rediscovery of more indigenous, look at indigenous tradition, and I'm also discovering great influence and cinema being greatly informed by like European masters. So how these two elements coexisted in a moment where I believe the idea of decolonization was setting in strong terms. This is the first question. And the other that has puzzled part of the audience I talked to yesterday, how does an art movement, if we want to summarize it this way, that Omar, for instance, you define in terms of rupture in your articles and your books, how is that funded by the state in terms of production means? How do you reconcile we, in our scheme of things, when a movement is running against a model, against classicism, but also against an idea of production or audience, it's normally running against the establishment. So how do you reconcile those two elements? If you understand my question, your first films were the first film funded by the FCC. How was that? Omar, did you understand my question? You want to put it in more English?
Yeah, I think the fact that, I mean, if we go to Gamal, perhaps, to begin with, the fact that Maya Durban was funded by the FFC, and you got a loan to make that film from the FFC. And there was a moment in the early 60s, late 70s, where a lot of these films were critiquing the establishment. They were doing quite unconventional things with storytelling techniques, and they were criticized a lot as well in the press and in the arts establishments as well, institutional organizations. Particularly your work and Money Goal's work in particular was criticized a lot as well in terms of its kind of experiments with formalism, which we hadn't seen before ever in Indian cinema. So, I mean, I think what Cecilia is trying to get at is how do you kind of make that?
I think, as I said earlier, that people tend to use binaries,
Right.
Which is, I think it's not called for in every case. For instance, Satyajit Ray and Ritik Ghatak are not to be treated as a binary. And the Indian Union and Karnataka are not to be treated as a binary. The Indian Union is supposed to be expressing the people, the aspirations of the people of that entire landscape, which is called India. Indeed, of all the languages, including cinema. I consider cinema to be an art form and a language on its own. Yeah. And I believe that as a person living on this planet, I should search for that individuation simultaneously with an epic vision. So the universal and the particular are also not to be treated as binaries opposed to one another. That is a kind of Aristotelian thinking, which is ridiculous. It doesn't come either from India or from Europe. It's a binary idea. It is this and its opposite. Very often, for instance, Maya Darpan, one of the most important things with it was color. And the color circle, again, to come back to why they call me a formalist, but what do they mean by formalism? The color circle was used by Indian dyers,
Of course.
to, from Pakistani dyers. In fact, they're not Pakistani or Indian or anything. But those dyers along the Indus,
we lost him in a very plastic position, though, I must say. A filmmaker position to be lost. Maybe Mr. Kasaravalli want to, while we get him back. Can you hear us, Mr. Shahani, or just, no, he can hear.
Girish can talk about it, but Umar, for Girish, it's a very different position because Girish had a private, he never went,
Yeah, the whole kind of question of funding and financing is a really important one for the history of parallel cinema. I mean, Girish, your financing was mostly private. Nothing was from either the state or the government. Am I right?
2 of my films are financed by the state.
Right.
But
Okay.
remaining 13 films are privately funded by individuals. And see, take a different position altogether
Questo.
about filmmaking and this one, you know. See, when we, one of my favorite film directors are the Japanese masters. One among them is Yasujiro Ozu. And Ozu, you know, he talks about Japan of that particular day, and becoming very particular, he reaches universal. He becomes a universal. That is a kind of a very interesting process, which I think can become a template for many people. But when I use the film, when I make the film, I don't borrow any of those things. But I look at my own from my own community, from my own country, from my own state, from my own community, commune. What is it that makes them so strong? And I look for that kind of a strength in these people, and that strength makes the film universal. You see, in Gata Shraddha, I have decided to, because it is about a ritual. I told my cinematographer, we need to use a circular motif right through the film. Whether it is in camera movement, or whether it is in composition, or whether it is in sound structure, whether it is in music, we had to adhere to that because it's about a ritual. But that ritual, that element has come from the kind of philosophy that it's a community and it's a Carnatic society which has adhered to. But the impact becomes universal. One who is looking at the impact, then if he goes back, then he will find all the meaning. So I'm not trying to impose my meaning on the viewer, but I am letting him discover the elements so that he can understand the emotions better. Which is actually I have learned from some of the masters, which is I have learned from my reading of literature, my reading of painting and music. And I am adapting that in my films.
Yeah, because your films have a strong degree of objectivity in the way in which they're filmed and the way in which you use your camera. But going back to kind of funding and distribution, your film Gati Shraddha was championed a lot by film societies in Canada's in Karnataka at the time. I mean, how important, because a lot of these films didn't get distributed into cinemas, parallel cinema films, so they travel through film societies, other ways and kind of routes. How important do you think that was for the success of this film?
My film was actually distributed. It was released.
Okay.
Did very well at the box office. Only my later films didn't find an audience, but then by then, we started getting this one from other sources, television and that kind of sources. But earlier films, they all were released in Karnataka, and they got back the money from the audience, from the spectators.
That's good to see, because I think in the early initial foundational years, there were films that weren't outside of Karnataka that were not even released. And I'm speaking here about Manikol's or Skiroti. I don't think it was released into cinemas. Maya Darpan, I think, wasn't released into cinemas either as well. I mean, Kumar, what do you think, how frustrating
because the distribution system in India is very different.
Yeah.
For the North Indian languages, there was no possibility of getting distribution of the sorts that mainstream cinema had captured. It's a bit like American cinema almost doesn't exist, I mean, in commercial houses. It's Hollywood cinema, and Hollywood is not American, And so what happened was that it's a well-known fact that in Hollywood, you don't even know who the owner of anything is for more than one day, So it's globalization at its, whatever, most innovative mode. But in India, all the cinema houses were all the cinema houses were open only to a certain kind of work, which and the distributors completely dictated what should happen in a piece of work. I mean, even the great, successes like Raj Kapoor, the greatest showman that North Indian cinema had sometimes to bow to people who thought that they were the makers of that, of his work. Raj Saab, in fact, spoke to me about it, and there are photographs of Raj Kapoor in dialogue with these people. Those distributors also who distributed his films have told me how often they would have had to change his beginnings and ends and middles, according to their likes and dislikes. So anyway, sometimes he was saved by the now non-existent Soviet Union, and sometimes by the Arabs who loved his cinema, the West Asian, as they are called, audiences. And his films, in fact, tried to deal with that contradiction, if you like, in the Marxist sense, not in the binary sense, and he engaged people like Khwaja Ahmad Abbas to write those scripts, for example. That is the marvelous thing, that struggle was addressed by, by the spirit to challenge a hegemony, coming from the market. And this is something that I had many discussions about, even with Manikda, with Satyajit Ray.
I mean, do you think parallel cinema tried to do that? It tried to challenge the hegemony of kind of contemporary, mainstream?
Yes, not only contemporary mainstream, but any other form of hegemony. Not only that of the cultural hegemony of the market, but other forms of hegemony, including that which came from Europe or America or the Soviet Union. It was all being addressed by the works which did not even want to see oneself like the other saw you. I had to, in Maya Darpan, what was I doing, if you ask me? I was trying very hard to acknowledge the light that falls on our faces, the colors that emerge from our bodies and from our dying, and to work out a set of liberation possibilities in our perception and cognition. It is not a question of being, just waving a flag,
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned color because Ashish Rajash wrote a review of your film, Maya Darpan. He said it was the most important color film to come out of Indian cinema for a very long time. But
somebody else who was from Britain.
Oh, right, okay.
And Mansell Stinson. He was the first person to bring it to light, more than anybody else. And Bansi Chandragupta, that is Satyajit Ray's art director, had worked with me on that film. Each wall had a different tint of, in the white. So that the action in front of it with a certain costume and the light falling from outside on it, the emotion, etc., was transformed into a way which only the cinema could yield, a meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm that kind of a formalist, you know.
I think my frustration is that you can't. I've never actually seen the film in an actual.
You haven't seen it
in a proper the way it was shot.
Yes, yes, indeed. I hope that Dungarpur will be able
well,
to.
this is kind of leading back to the kind of going full circle and how important film preservation and restoration, the work that Shavindra has been doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's going to be so important, kind of rescuing and reclaiming these films, particularly your work, where colour is so important, and we need to see these films in the proper context in which you kind of made them.
Yes. You know, what is there in cinema actually? There's languages of different. In fact, in Khayal Gatha, which we've just seen, there are many languages.
Yeah.
You know, and there are colors. The color palette here in Khayal Gatha is very different from the one which I use in Maya Darpan, because it is directly related to the miniature paintings of that entire region, from Persia to India, that entire region, you know, it doesn't exclude any of it. I owe it to all of them who made the Taj Mahal, for example, that Khayal Gatha could be made, you know. And they certainly extend to the borders of Greece, you know. Persia and Greece were at war most times of history. So the point is that the dynamic elements of cinema are these color, languages, as normal languages, spoken languages, and the enunciation of the languages in song, in music, you know, in sound, you know, the khayal form, for example, takes off from certain angas, certain things which come from all the languages. The Indian languages, each language has all the great mainstreams of the world. You know, the Indo-Tibetan and the Arabic and all that, the European, everything comes together in it. So for me, that is the world, and that is what cinema is capable of. And I would like to work towards that. And for that to give us insights every day into our everyday life, wherever we are. I'm in Pune at the moment, you know. You are in England, where my daughters are as well, you know. And my cousins are perhaps living in Pakistan. I don't look upon them as any different. And I know every one of us has very similar problems, you know. The light outside today here is very dull, it's raining. The light is very, very sharp and striking in the deserts of the world, you know, where it's not raining. But what we face in our everyday life is very, very similar. So it is not universal against the particular. The particular has to deal with the universal all the time, unfortunately, you know.
I think it's really heartwarming to hear both you and Girish talk about cinema as this universal kind of form, but also the emphasis you put on languages. And that was such a beautiful moment for all parallel cinema in the late 60s, early 70s, was the creative hybridity that we saw, which was really extraordinary, because you had this, you know, range of filmmaking techniques and kind of real kind of dispensation of non-narrative, of narrative storytelling, a movement, a shift toward non-narrative kind of storytelling, which was in your work, which was in so many, Mrinal Sen's work in particular at the time as well. But one of my last questions really is kind of, when we look at film history and the way it's been written, why is parallel cinema, Indian parallel cinema, always kind of left out and never really kind of given the due and the recognition that it really deserves? Because it's if you compare it, it's a moment that is comparable to Italian neorealism, to the German New Wave cinema of the 70s, to the Nouvelle Vague. But when we look at film history and we look at I'm not going to say radical because I'm going to open a can of worms if I say radical. Because radical, I don't know, we're going into so many semantics and politics about what is radical, but
Yes.
why do you think, this is a question for both of you, why do you think that parallel cinema is not talked about enough in history books and it's often kind of left out and kind of ignored? Is it to do with the fact that a lot of the films have not been screened publicly in Europe for such a long time, and that access to these films, which Shavindra is now turning around, has been an obstacle and a problem for film programmers, curators, etc.? What do you think?
Yes, definitely. There is a kind of global, misunderstanding of what the cinema is capable of, and what indeed each person, no matter what background he comes from, which little region he comes from, like in Kerala, which is in South India, very close to Karnataka. Every district has a different cuisine, and its rulers were also polyglot, right? For centuries. And Kerala was attacked by the Dutch, the British, the French. And you still see ships from there. And of course, there was a great Arab presence ever since 5,000 years, and the Chinese, also were in the Indian Ocean there, operating. And all this culture shifted from the lagoons of Kerala to the lagoons of Venice, Together, those ships went there. And Venice consolidated it all into the Renaissance. What a wonderful thing. So again, I want to compliment, Bologna and Italy, and for having understood this fact that you can indeed take influences from everywhere, even from your colonizer. Mahatma Gandhi taught us that. Let the winds of all the countries from everywhere blow through our house, And that means languages. And it has actually happened. I made a film on the flute, for example. And it's the British who told us that you have more than 200 odd flutes made out of bamboo. Just the flute, We have that kind of diversity. And of course, we must have that diversity. And I will fight till the end. There is a tribe in India of the Rathwas, in which every human being, every male human being, makes a flute. Otherwise, he cannot have a girlfriend. He makes his own flute, and that's what Krishna is about as well. This is the kind of country we live in, and this is the kind of world we live in. We must let every individual express herself in whatever way it is possible. Whether it's through color, through language, words, sounds, And right now I'm working on individuation, which can touch that very, very timber, which is given to us, each one of us separately. You can scientifically prove that also. Like each instrument that you make, like our tanpura, for example, the drum. Each one of them has its own timbre, which is it's not possible for another instrument to have. And right up to the Renaissance and Baroque period in music in the West, so right up to the Elizabethan times, like in UK, you can hear the Shrutis because each instrument was made that way. And our bodies are made that way, that each one of us has an individuation which is irreplaceable. That we might call it the soul, if you like, but that's what it is. Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah.
Girish, what's your kind of response to my question about why is parallel cinema often kind of is left out of kind of the way in which film history has been written? What are your opinions and thoughts on that?
Probably for the same reason why Asian cinema doesn't find a place in the history of cinema written by others. There's a this one for European cinema, big chunk on American cinema, and very few pages for Asian cinema, and just a paragraph for Indian cinema. And, that is the case even with Indian cinema. When they come to write about Indian cinema, they write mostly about Bollywood cinema, not even about popular cinema of the South or Bengal. And when it comes to the parallel cinema made in regional languages, I shouldn't be using the term regional language, but the languages other than Hindi, they don't even get shown in other parts of India. That's one of the reasons.
Right.
Even a master like the works of master like Satyajit Ray is not seen in other parts of India. So how do you expect them to write about him? Like, you see, I know a lot of my friends haven't seen many of the important films made by Satyajit Ray. And my own home state, the neighboring state to my state is Kerala. And there are two very important filmmakers in Kerala, and their works are not seen here in Karnataka. So many of the film reviewers, film historians are not familiar with their works. So, but whereas they are very familiar with films made in Bollywood films made in Hindi.
That's
so
interesting.
that's one of the pardon?
Yeah, I find that fascinating. The point about kind of regional kind of specificities and how films don't kind of transcend and get distributed into.
There are many hurdles. One is that, of course, without subtitles you can't follow those films because the language is made in a different language. Second thing is that the reach is very limited. Like there are very important filmmakers in the Northeast, and somehow we don't get to see their films at all. We know they have been appreciated. They have been shown in very many festivals where they have won awards, but we don't get to see them. So that is the case. Why these kind of films are not written about. In fact, my first film is quite well seen all over India because it was taken up by Film Society Federation, and then they distributed it all over India. But now the Film Society movement is not very strong, so none of my later films are not shown.
And we are making films in 55 languages, right? 55. And we have 10 major film industries. 10 major. The South, which I want to tell people who are not aware, the South constitutes nearly 60% of the film heritage. It's not Bollywood, it's the South. So, you have, and for everyone there, I know Chichilia will be running short of time.
Right, we can take a few minutes more.
All that Kumati, another great filmmaker, G. Arvindan, and Girish would agree that he's very little known. And I was, when I was studying at the FTI, I used to think two of some of the greatest filmmakers, Adur and Arvindan, and both of them came from Kerala, and I loved Arvindan's work. And Kumati would be bringing it back because you would have not heard of him had Film Foundation and Cinetica di Bologna had they not restored this film back onto people. So that's one of you can find answers in that particular film itself, that how much of regional cinema is not known.
Yeah.
There's so much that can be restored. Obviously, there's so much that one can restore because it's about obviously a long research and it's about funding. But I think one step, by working with you at this strand we're presenting here, really for like 15, 16 months to locate the elements, the prints, the DCPs, I think that one main effort that could be done by the community, the FIEF community, is to look in their own collections really thoroughly. And I think more and more we need a shared database of what's out there, because we might not always have the funding for restoration, but it's really good to know what is available, where we can start from in case there are funding or there's funding to join forces to restore a film or preserve a film. So I think that looking really carefully in one's collection can really be a first step.
I just wanted to say the restoration of Gumati is a huge, huge, significant moment for parallel cinema in terms of making that accessible now to other audiences who've never come across Aravindan's work. So this is going to open a door for parallel cinema internationally, I think, that we've not seen before. So that in itself is an extraordinary step, and that's, you know, hats off to Bologna and you guys and Shavindra for kind of taking that huge step. It's massive, really, for parallel cinema. Thank you,
Umar.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind if there's a question from the audience to take, even though you can't see them, but if you can, if anybody has a question. Se qualcuno ha una domanda, una curiosità, una domanda, già che abbiamo questi registi qui con noi. No, too shy. There's so much we could talk about, really. I mean, each of these conversations should last, you know, double of this time, and it wouldn't be enough. I really appreciate you being part of this, and it really made a great difference to hear from you, to have your standpoint, and to be able to recall your own experiences. And I realize, I mean, we realize every day that much of what we are able to see is, you know, partially caused by what we can provide and what we can see. Also partially from a very Eurocentric, Western-centric film theory that has dominated for decades. And also, if I might say, like it happened in all major artistic waves. I think of the Nouvelle Vague, when there's also a tiny, maybe, responsibility on the filmmakers of a certain very popular or acclaimed filmmakers of the time, like the filmmakers of the Nouvelle Vague in France had basically cut away a major part of French film history that is now been, that for a while now has been discovered. So, for instance, we were talking about Manicol, and we screened the film yesterday, Uski Roti, and if I'm not mistaken, Ray didn't like the film, and Manicol wasn't able to make a new film for a while because of that. So I think it's obviously always a combination, a concurrence of events as to why some movements or moments in history or history of the arts are neglected. And I think it's our collective effort from all sides of the earth to try to change that, from each of us from our own field of belonging.
Yep. Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you want to add anything else before we close? Okay. Thank you so much for being with us.
Have a great screening.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. The audience is applauding you. I can't turn the computer. You're getting an applause. Thank you.
Bye-bye.